The sun did not rise on Arthur Pendelton's bedroom so much as it interrogated him. A single, merciless beam of light pierced through a gap in the motorized blackout curtains of his Canary Wharf penthouse, landing directly across his eyes like a heated blade. Arthur groaned, a sound that originated somewhere in the depths of his soul and died in a throat that felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper and doused in vinegar. He didn't move. He knew from 32 years of experience that any sudden movement would cause the miniature construction crew currently operating jackhammers inside his skull to redouble their efforts. "Siri," he croaked, his voice sounding like a rusted gate. "Close the curtains." "I'm sorry, Arthur," the polite, digital voice chirped from his nightstand. "I'm having trouble connecting to the internet." Arthur squinted. That was the first sign. Usually, his smart home was as efficient as the high-frequency trading algorithms he managed for a living. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers feeling like overcooked sausages. He found the device face down on the floor next to an empty bottle of Glenfiddich 21-year-old, a bottle that had been full at 9 p.m. the previous evening. As the screen flickered to life, the brightness felt like a flashbang. He blinked through the stinging salt of his own sweat, waiting for his vision to stabilize. He expected the usual, 3 missed calls from his mother, 42 frantic Slack messages from the London trading floor, and perhaps a confirmation email for the vintage Rolex he'd been eyeing on Chrono 24. He saw the missed calls. He saw the Slack messages. But the top notification, the one highlighted in gold with a priority, urgent tag, was from a website he only vaguely remembered visiting, globalassetleaky.ion.com. The subject line was a nightmare wrapped in a hallucination: "Final notice, your purchase of the Oakhaven estate is complete." Oakhaven, Arthur whispered, the name tasting like ash. What the hell is an Oakhaven? He tapped the email. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. "Dear Mr. Pendelton, congratulations. You have successfully outbid 4 other participants for lot number 742, the incorporated hamlet of Oakhaven. As per our one-click acquisition protocol for verified high-net-worth individuals, the total sum of £1,540,000 has been successfully debited from your linked investment account. You are now the 100% legal owner of all land, structures, and communal rights associated with the village of Oakhaven, Cumbria. Your digital deed is attached. A physical key handover ceremony has been scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the town hall. See map. Welcome to the landed gentry." Arthur's heart didn't just skip a beat, it performed a frantic, panicked tap dance against his ribs. He sat up, ignoring the explosion of pain in his temples. He scrolled down to the item description. There were photos. Granular, poorly lit photos that looked like they had been taken by a ghost in the 1970s. A crumbling stone pub. A row of cottages that seemed to be leaning into each other for emotional support. A bridge that looked more like a suggestion than a structure. And a vast, soggy expanse of green moorland that appeared to be inhabited primarily by mist. 1.5 million, Arthur breathed, his hyperventilation beginning in earnest. I spent £1.5 million, on a ruin. He began to piece together the hazy fragments of the night before. He had been celebrating. He had closed a deal that netted his firm 8 figures. He had come home, poured a glass of scotch, and felt empty. The kind of emptiness that only a man with a 6-figure salary and no hobbies can feel. He remembered opening his laptop. He remembered a pop-up ad for an emergency asset auction. He remembered thinking, I should invest in real estate. Land is a finite resource. They aren't making any more of it. In his drunken, scotch-fueled arrogance, he hadn't looked for a luxury condo in Mayfair or a beachfront villa in Ibiza. No, drunk Arthur had wanted a kingdom. Drunk Arthur wanted to be a duke. Drunk Arthur had found an entire village for the price of a 2-bedroom flat in London and thought, what a bargain. I'll take the whole thing. He frantically checked his bank app. The balance was gone. The numbers, the beautiful, comforting numbers that represented years of 12-hour shifts and soul-crushing stress, had been replaced by a cavernous void. He threw the phone across the bed and buried his face in his hands. Maybe it's a scam, he told the empty room. Yes. It's an elaborate phishing scam. No one buys a town on an app. That's not how the world works. He lunged for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys as he searched for Oakhaven, Cumbria. The search results were devastatingly real. Wikipedia: Oakhaven is a civil parish and village in the Eden district of Cumbria, England. Historically known for its wool production, the village has seen a decline in population since the closure of the local quarry in 1982. He clicked on a news article from 3 months ago. Council declares Oakhaven unviable, entire village put up for private auction to cover centuries-old tax debt. Arthur stared at a photo of the village square. There was a statue of a man holding a sheep, and in the background, a very large, very angry-looking goat was chewing on a campaign poster. He looked around his penthouse. Everything was glass, chrome, and overpriced minimalism. He was a man of the city. He didn't know how to fix a leaking roof. He didn't know how to manage communal rights. He didn't even know how to grow a tomato. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was no longer a high-flying London trader with a bright future. He was a man who owned a broken bridge, 12 eccentric strangers, and a goat. He looked back at the email. At the bottom, in tiny, legally binding font, it said, "All sales are final. No refunds. No exchanges. Caveat emptor." Arthur Pendelton stood up, walked to his floor-to-ceiling window, and looked out over the glittering skyline of London. For the first time in his life, the city felt small. "Well," he whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his chest. "I suppose I should go pack my boots." Then he paused, looking down at his feet. Wait. Do I even own boots? He didn't. He owned 12 pairs of hand-stitched Italian loafers. Arthur grabbed his phone and opened Amazon. If he was going to be a lord, he was going to need some damn Wellington boots. And perhaps a book on how to talk to farmers. The journey to Oakhaven had begun. The transition from the glass and steel canyons of London to the jagged, moss-covered peaks of the Lake District was not a gradual shift for Arthur Pendelton, it was a sensory assault. His sleek, midnight blue Porsche Taycan, a car designed for smooth autobahns and climate-controlled underground parking, groaned as its low-profile tires hit the first of many potholes on the unnamed road leading to Oakhaven. The GPS, which had been Arthur's North Star for his entire adult life, had given up 3 miles back. The elegant digital map had simply faded into a gray void, replaced by a polite but firm message, "Navigation unavailable. Please follow local landmarks." Landmarks. Arthur muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. There are no landmarks. It's just rocks and suicidal sheep. He checked his battery. 12%. In London, 12% was enough to get him to 3 different high-speed charging stations. Out here, in the shadow of the Cumbrian fells, 12% felt like a death sentence. The rain, which had started as a light drizzle in Manchester, was now a relentless, horizontal sheet of water that seemed determined to wash his expensive German engineering right off the side of the cliff. Then, he saw it. A hand-painted wooden sign, hanging by a single rusted hinge, creaked in the wind. Oakhaven. Drive slowly. We have no doctor. Below it, in faded spray paint, someone had added, "and no refunds." Arthur rounded a final bend, and the hamlet of Oakhaven revealed itself. It wasn't a village so much as a collection of architectural accidents huddled together for warmth. There were exactly 7 stone cottages, their roofs covered in a thick carpet of neon green moss. A small, humpbacked stone bridge arched over a swollen, churning stream. At the center of it all stood a square building that looked like a cross between a church and a prison, the town hall. He pulled the Porsche into the village square, which was actually just a patch of gravel and mud in front of a pub called the Drunken Duck. As he turned off the engine, the silence that rushed in was deafening. No sirens. No hum of air conditioning. Just the rhythmic thwop-thwop of rain hitting his sunroof. Arthur stepped out of the car. His foot immediately sank 4 inches into a cold, viscous puddle of mud. God, damn it, he hissed, looking down at his suede loafers, the ones that had cost him more than a month's rent for a normal person. They were now a souvenir of the Cumbrian landscape. You the new landlord, then? The voice was like gravel being shaken in a tin can. Arthur looked up. Standing under the eaves of the pub was a woman who appeared to be made entirely of tweed and disapproval. She had a mop of grey hair that defied the laws of physics and a pair of spectacles held together by a piece of blue twine. In her hand, she held a ring of keys large enough to belong to a medieval dungeon. Arthur Pendelton, he said, trying to summon his boardroom alpha persona despite the mud creeping into his socks. I believe I bought this place. On the internet. The woman stared at him for a long, uncomfortable minute. She looked at his designer coat, his manicured fingernails, and his silent, dead electric car. Well, she said finally. At least you're not a developer. The last one we had tried to measure the pub for glamping pods and nearly got tossed in the beck. I'm Martha. I run the pub, the post office, and when the wind is right, the local radio station. Which is just me shouting out the window. She tossed the keys at him. Arthur caught them with a clumsy fumble, the heavy iron cold against his palms. The manor house is the big one at the end of the lane, Martha continued, pointing toward a structure that looked significantly more haunted than manor. The roof on the east wing is more of a suggestion than a reality. And the plumbing works on a system of prayer and gravity. Mostly prayer. Right, Arthur said, his head spinning. And the town council? I was told there was a meeting. Martha let out a bark of a laugh. You're looking at half of it? The other half is inside, drying off. And you'd better come meet the deputy mayor before he eats your upholstery. The deputy. Before Arthur could finish, a loud, discordant bay echoed from behind the pub. A large, shaggy white goat with one horn curving aggressively forward and the other missing entirely trotted out into the square. It had a yellow high-visibility vest strapped loosely around its middle. The goat walked straight up to Arthur's Porsche, looked at its reflection in the pristine door, and then deliberately licked the handle. That's Barnaby, Martha said. He's been deputy mayor since the 2018 election. He won by a landslide because he was the only candidate who didn't promise to raise the council tax. He also has a taste for German leather, so I'd lock your doors if I were you. Arthur stared at the goat. The goat stared back with horizontal pupils that seemed to see right through Arthur's financial portfolio and into his very soul. I've made a mistake, Arthur whispered to himself. Big time, Martha agreed, though there was a tiny, terrifying glint of amusement in her eyes. But you've paid the tax debt, Mr. Pendelton. That makes you the first person to put money into this town since the Queen's Silver Jubilee. That makes you a hero to some, and a target to the rest. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door of the Drunken Duck. A warm, golden light spilled out into the gray afternoon, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, stale ale, and something that smelled suspiciously like wet dog. Come on in, Lord Arthur. The village is waiting. They want to know if you're going to fix the bridge or if they should just start building a raft. Arthur looked back at his car, then at the mud-caked ruins of his former life. He realized he didn't even have a signal to call a tow truck. He was trapped. He was the owner of a dying village, a victim of his own drunken hubris, and his only political ally was a goat in a high-vis vest. He took a deep breath, adjusted his damp coat, and stepped into the pub. As the door swung shut behind him, The heavy iron keys jingled in his pocket, a weight that felt less like property and more like a pair of handcuffs. The meeting of the Oakhaven Town Council was about to begin, and Arthur Pendelton was the only one without a chair. The heavy oak door of the Drunken Duck creaked on its hinges with a groan that sounded suspiciously like a warning. As Arthur Pendelton stepped inside, the heat hit him like a physical wall, a thick, humid mixture of peat smoke, spilled cider, and the unmistakable scent of damp wool. The pub was small, with a ceiling so low that Arthur, who stood at a modest 6 feet, felt the urge to duck. Every surface was dark wood, polished to a dull sheen by decades of leaning elbows. But it wasn't the decor that stopped him in his tracks, it was the silence. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. They were seated around a long, scarred trestle table that looked like it had been repurposed from a Viking longship. These were the apostles, the remnants of Oakhaven's population. They didn't look like a welcoming committee, they looked like a jury that had already reached a verdict. "Take a seat, Lord Arthur," Martha said, her voice cutting through the crackle of the hearth. She gestured to a stool at the head of the table that looked dangerously unstable. "We've been waiting. The tea is cold, but the tempers are hot." Arthur sat, his 3,000-pound charcoal suit trousers sticking to the beer tacky wood. He cleared his throat, trying to find his closing bell confidence. "Look, everyone. I think there's been a massive misunderstanding. I'm not a lord. I'm a trader. I buy and sell things I can't see. This whole buying a town thing was it was an accidental click. A technical error." A man at the far end of the table, whose face was so wrinkled it resembled a topographical map of the Andes, slammed a calloused hand down. "An error? You bought our debt, lad. You bought our homes, our bridge, and our burial plots. In Oakhaven, an error is planting potatoes too early. This is a catastrophe." "That's Silas," Martha whispered, leaning over the bar. "He's the master of the bridge. Or he would be, if the bridge wasn't currently sitting at the bottom of the river. I can just sell it back," Arthur said, his voice rising in pitch. "I'll put it back on the auction site. I'll even take a loss. You can go back to, however you were living before." A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit and holding a tablet with a cracked screen, shook her head. "You don't get it, Mr. Pendelton. My name is Chloe. I'm the head of infrastructure, which mostly means I try to keep the 1950s generator from exploding. We were on the verge of being seized by the crown. You paid the back taxes. If you sell us now, the only buyer waiting in the wings is Sterling Global." The name hit the room like a cold draft. The villagers shivered. "Sterling Global?" Arthur asked. "The real estate conglomerate." "They don't want a village," Chloe said, tapping her tablet. "They want the land. They want to turn this valley into a luxury eco-landfill for the wealthy. They'll bulldoze the cottages, pave over the cemetery, and turn the Drunken Duck into a processing plant for organic waste. You're not just our landlord, Arthur. You're our shield." Arthur felt the weight of the iron keys in his pocket grow 10 times heavier. He wasn't just a guy who made a bad eBay purchase. He was the accidental guardian of a way of life. "Let's see the books," Arthur said, falling back on his only real skill. "If I'm the owner, I need to see the financials. There has to be a way to generate revenue." Martha reached under the bar and hauled out a ledger that was 3 inches thick and bound in what looked like actual goat skin. She thudded it down in front of him. Arthur opened it, expecting spreadsheets and VAT returns. Instead, he found handwritten entries in fading ink. 1994, sold 3 sheep to pay for the post office roof. 2002, fined by the district for unauthorized goat in a public office. 2023, total revenue, £42, from a lost hiker who bought a map and a pickled egg. "This isn't a ledger," Arthur whispered, horrified. This is a diary of a slow-motion car crash. We have assets. Piped up Mrs. Gable, a tiny woman in a hand-knit cardigan who was sitting next to Silas. We have the Oakhaven wool. It's the finest in the north. Mrs. Gable, Martha said gently. The last loom broke in 2010. We've been selling the wool to a carpet factory in Leeds for pennies. Arthur looked around the table. He saw Silas, whose family had likely farmed this land since the Doomsday Book. He saw Chloe, who was clearly too smart for this place but stayed out of some stubborn sense of loyalty. He saw the twins, two silent men in their 60s who were currently sharing a single pint of ale and nodding in unison. Then, he looked at Barnaby the goat, who had somehow wandered into the pub and was now chewing on the corner of Arthur's leather briefcase. You have a debt, Arthur said, his mind finally starting to whirl. The auction site mentioned a centuries-old wool debt. What is it? Silas cleared his throat. It's the King's levy of 1722. Oakhaven was supposed to provide 10,000 yards of high-grade wool for the Royal Navy. A storm hit, the sheep got the rot, and we missed the deadline. The interest has been compounding for 300 years. The Crown never collected, but the debt stayed on the books. That's why no one could ever invest here. The debt is bigger than the value of the land. Arthur's eyes narrowed. In the world of high finance, uncollectible debt was his bread and butter. He looked at the ledger again, then at Chloe's tablet. Wait, Arthur said, a familiar spark of predatory instinct lighting up in his chest. You said the Crown never collected? Who holds the debt now? It was bundled into a private portfolio and sold to a distressed asset firm, Chloe said. Sterling Global bought it last month. That's how they're going to force us out. They'll call in the debt, we won't be able to pay, and they'll seize the land through the High Court. Arthur felt a slow, wicked grin spreading across his face. For the first time since he woke up with a hangover, he felt like he was on solid ground. They're using a vulture fund strategy, Arthur said. I've used that same strategy to take over 3 tech startups and a regional airline. Sterling Global thinks they're playing against a bunch of Cumbrian farmers. He stood up, the stool clattering behind him. He looked at the 12 apostles. I came here to find a way to get my money back and leave, Arthur announced, his voice echoing in the small pub. But I hate Sterling Global. Their CEO, Marcus Sterling, once outbid me for a penthouse in Dubai just because he could. He's a bully, and he's using bad math. What are you saying, lad? Silas asked, squinting. I'm saying I'm not selling, Arthur said. And I'm not running. If I'm the Lord of Oakhaven, then by God, we're going to go to war. We have 24 hours before Sterling's legal team arrives to serve the papers. Chloe, I need your tablet. Martha, get me a double scotch the good stuff this time. And Silas. Go find that goat. We're going to need a deputy mayor who knows how to look intimidating in a photo op. The villagers exchanged glances. They didn't entirely trust the city boy in his ruined shoes, but for the first time in 50 years, someone was talking about a future that didn't involve a bulldozer. One more thing, Arthur added, pointing at the ledger. Does anyone here know how to use TikTok? Because if we're going to save this hole in the ground, we're going to need to make it the most famous hole in the ground in the world. The apostles didn't cheer, they were Cumbrians, after all, but Silas did give a slow, solemn nod. Martha poured the scotch. And in the corner, Barnaby the goat let out a loud, defiant bleat. The battle for Oakhaven had begun. The morning didn't begin with the gentle chirping of birds or the soft rustle of wind through the fells. It began with the rhythmic, bone-shaking thrum of a twin-engine Airbus H-160 helicopter. The sleek, black machine descended like a carbon fiber vulture into the center of Oakhaven's grazing meadow, sending a dozen confused sheep and one very indignant Barnaby the goat scurrying for the stone walls. Arthur Pendelton stood on the porch of the town hall, clutching a lukewarm mug of Martha's medicinal tea. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his designer shirt was hopelessly wrinkled, and he had spent the last 8 hours huddled over Chloe's cracked tablet, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer, petty desire to ruin Marcus Sterling's day. The helicopter's blade slowed to a whine, and the door slid open. Out stepped Marcus Sterling. He was exactly as Arthur remembered, dressed in a tailored navy suit that cost more than most family cars, teeth so white they looked like they could glow in the dark, and an aura of condescension that could chill a room faster than an open window in January. Behind him trailed 3 lawyers carrying slim, ominous leather briefcases. "Arthur!" Sterling called out, his voice booming across the quiet valley. He didn't walk through the mud, he seemed to glide over it on some invisible path of pure arrogance. "I heard you had a bit of a midlife crisis. Buying a Hamlet? Really? I knew the London market was stressful, but I didn't think you'd gone completely off the deep end." Arthur didn't move. "Hello, Marcus. You're trespassing. This is private property. Entirely private." Sterling reached the porch, stopping just short of a particularly large puddle. He looked around at the leaning cottages and the moss-covered pub with a look of genuine disgust. "Private property? Arthur, this isn't property. This is a liability. It's a sinkhole. I'm here to do what I always do, provide an exit strategy for the desperate." He snapped his fingers, and one of the lawyers stepped forward, extending a gold-nibbed pen and a thick stack of documents. £3 million, Sterling said, his smile widening. "Double what you paid at auction. You walk away with a tidy profit, your dignity somewhat intact, and I get to turn this valley into something productive. We've already got the blueprints for the Sterling Bioindustrial Center. High-end waste processing. Very green. Very lucrative. You want to turn their homes into a landfill," Arthur said flatly. "I want to turn a dead village into a functioning asset," Sterling corrected. "Now, sign the papers. My pilot is on a clock, and I have a lunch meeting in Monaco." Arthur took the documents. He flipped through them slowly, the paper crisp and expensive. The villagers had begun to emerge from their homes: Silas, Mrs. Gable, the twins standing in a silent semicircle behind Arthur. They looked small against the backdrop of the black helicopter, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and faint, flickering hope. "It's a tempting offer, Marcus," Arthur said, looking up. "But I have a counter-proposal." Sterling chuckled. "You're in no position to negotiate. We hold the 1,722 wool debt. We've already filed the motion in the High Court to freeze the assets of the Oakhaven estate. If you don't sell to me now, I'll simply seize it in 48 hours for the cost of the interest alone. You'll lose your 1.5 million, and these people will be evicted by Monday." Arthur took a long sip of his tea. "That's the thing about the 1,722 wool debt, Marcus. It's a fascinating piece of history. But while you were flying here, I was doing some late-night research into microsovereignty and digital land trusts. Do you know what happens when a private individual pays off the state tax debt of a historically autonomous parish?" Sterling's smile faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. "What are you talking about?" "Chloe," Arthur called out. The young woman stepped forward, holding her tablet high. On the screen, a live stream was running. The viewer count was ticking up with dizzying speed: 145,000. 160,000, 200,000. Hashtag Save Oakhaven, the man who bought a town, and the corporate shark trying to eat it. "Meet the internet, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "Last night, I didn't just look at your debt. I incorporated Oakhaven as the world's first decentralized autonomous village. I issued 1 million Oakhaven governance tokens at £1 each. We sold out in 3 hours. The global community of digital nomads, history buffs, and people who just plain hate you has crowdfunded the entire 1,722 debt. You what? Sterling hissed. The money is already in an escrow account held by a neutral third-party law firm, Arthur continued. We've filed a countersuit. The debt is settled. Oakhaven no longer owes the crown, and it certainly doesn't owe you. But that's not the best part. Arthur pointed to Barnaby the goat, who was currently chewing on the landing gear of Sterling's helicopter. We've officially applied for special historical status under the new Heritage Act. Because this village hasn't changed since the 70s, it's technically a living museum. You can't bulldoze a museum, Marcus. Not without a decade of environmental impact studies that will cost you more than the land is worth. The villagers began to murmur. Silas let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Sterling's face turned a deep, bruised purple. You think a TikTok video and some tokens can stop me? I have the best lawyers in London. I'll bury you in paperwork until your great-grandchildren are bankrupt. Maybe, Arthur shrugged. But look behind you. Sterling turned. Coming up the narrow, winding road was a battered old Land Rover. It was followed by a van with a satellite dish on the roof. Then another. And another. The BBC, Sky News, and a very popular YouTuber who specializes in urban exploration, Arthur explained. I invited them. They're very interested in the story of the London banker who accidentally bought a town and decided to save it from the vulture of Wall Street. You're the villain of the week, Marcus. And in 2026, being the villain is very, very bad for your stock price. Sterling looked at the approaching media caravan, then at the villagers, and finally at Arthur. The corporate shark was, for the first time in his life, out of his element. He wasn't in a boardroom, he was in a mud pit, surrounded by people who had nothing to lose and a man who had rediscovered his soul in a bottle of scotch. This isn't over, Arthur, Sterling spat, retreating toward his helicopter. Actually, it is, Arthur shouted over the rising roar of the engines. And Marcus? Stay off my grass. Barnaby doesn't like the taste of your fuel. The helicopter rose, whipping up a gale of wind and rain that drenched the lawyers but left Arthur standing tall. As the machine vanished into the gray clouds, a profound silence returned to the valley, followed immediately by a roar of cheering from the 12 apostles. Martha stepped up to Arthur and slapped him hard on the shoulder. Not bad, Lord Arthur. Not bad at all. But don't get too cocky. The internet might have paid the debt, but the post office still needs a new boiler, and Silas says the goat has developed a taste for fiber optic cables. Arthur looked at the crowd of people who were now his neighbors, his responsibility, and his friends. He looked at his ruined shoes and his empty bank account. He had never felt more exhausted, and he had never felt more alive. One thing at a time, Martha, Arthur laughed. First, let's go give those reporters an interview. And someone get Barnaby away from that satellite van. We need that signal. 6 months had passed since the great helicopter siege of Oakhaven, and the village looked, well, it still looked like a collection of stone cottages leaning on each other for emotional support. But if you looked closer, the moss on the roofs was now interspersed with discrete, high-speed satellite dishes, and the main street featured a single, solar-powered charging station that Barnaby the goat used primarily as a chin-scratcher. Arthur Pendelton stood on the balcony of the manor house, or rather, the sturdy wooden platform he'd built to replace the collapsed stone balcony. He wasn't wearing a bespoke charcoal suit. He was wearing a thick, itchy wool sweater knitted by Mrs. Gable, a pair of rugged work boots caked in honest-to-God Cumbrian soil, and a pair of spectacles he'd bought at a pharmacy because he'd spent too many nights staring at spreadsheets under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. He took a sip of his coffee, not the artisan, triple-filtered espresso from his London days, but a sturdy, heart-stopping brew Martha made in the pub. Morning, Lord Artie. Arthur looked down. Chloe was crossing the square, her grease-stained jumpsuit replaced by a high-tech windbreaker. She was carrying a box of server components. "Don't call me that, Chloe," Arthur shouted back, though there was no real heat in his voice. "I'm just the guy who pays the property taxes." "You're the chief executive sovereign of the Oakhaven Deo," she teased. "And the 10 a.m. meeting with the Swiss architects is in 10 minutes. They want to know if we can hide the fiber optic cables inside the dry stone walls." Arthur sighed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Oakhaven had become the world's unlikeliest success story. After the TikTok video went viral, the Oakhaven governance tokens hadn't just paid the debt, they had created a massive development fund. But instead of building a mall, the village had voted on every single penny spent. They had built a digital nomad hub inside the old, abandoned quarry office. They had restored the cottages using traditional methods but added geothermal heating. Oakhaven was now the premier destination for burnt-out tech geniuses and writers who wanted to live in the 18th century but needed 5G to upload their manuscripts. Arthur walked through his house. The leaking roof in the east wing had been fixed, though it still groaned when the wind came off the fells. His £200,000 Porsche was still parked in the barn, but he rarely drove it. It was too low for the roads, and frankly, he preferred his battered 1998 Land Rover Defender. It had a character that the Porsche lacked, mainly the character of a vehicle that refused to die out of sheer spite. He made his way down to the Drunken Duck. The pub had become the unofficial headquarters of the new Oakhaven. Inside, Silas was teaching a 24-year-old coding prodigy from San Francisco how to properly shear a sheep, while Martha was busy managing a hybrid booking system for the village's 3 eco-cottages. "The usual, Arthur?" Martha asked, pulling a pint of Barnaby's Bitter, the local ale that had become a cult hit in the craft beer world. "Please," Arthur said, sliding onto a stool. "You look tired," Silas remarked, not looking up from his wool shearing demonstration. "Too much time on that Zoom thing." "It's the London lawyers," Arthur admitted. "Sterling Global is still trying to sue us for interference with a commercial acquisition. They're mad because our token value has tripled and their landfill project is dead in the water." "Let 'em sue," Silas grunted. "They can't serve papers if they can't find the village on a map. I swapped the road signs around this morning. If a process server tries to find us, they'll end up in a bog 3 miles north." Arthur laughed. It was a deep, genuine sound, something he hadn't heard from himself in years. He thought back to that night in London. The scotch, the loneliness, the accidental click of a mouse. He remembered the sheer terror he felt when he saw the £1.5 million debit from his account. At the time, he thought he had destroyed his life. He thought he had thrown away everything he had worked for. But looking around the pub, seeing the life and energy in a village that had been a week away from death, he realized he hadn't bought a town. He had bought a soul. A notification chirped on his phone. It was a calendar reminder, Friday night. 9 p.m. Underneath, in his own handwriting, it said, "Lock the phone. Going to get hammered tonight, Artie?" Martha asked with a wink. "Not a chance," Arthur said, raising his pint. "I've learned my lesson. If I drink tonight, I'll probably end up buying a lighthouse in Norway or an island in the Pacific. And frankly, I don't think Barnaby would like the commute." Just then, the door of the pub swung open. Barnaby the goat trotted in, wearing his signature high-vis vest, which now featured a small official deputy mayor badge. He walked straight up to Arthur, looked at his boots, and let out a long, demanding bleat. "He wants his tribute," Chloe said, coming in behind him. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a high-protein organic kale cracker, the only thing the goat would accept these days. Barnaby crunched it happily, then leaned his shaggy head against Arthur's knee. "You know," Arthur whispered to the goat, "for £1.5 million, I probably could have bought a yacht. I could be in the Mediterranean right now, surrounded by models and drinking champagne. Barnaby let out a soft, flatulent noise and started chewing on Arthur's shoelace. "Yeah," Arthur smiled, patting the goat's head. "You're right. This is much better." As the sun began to set over the Cumbrian fells, casting a golden-orange glow over the stone walls and the bubbling stream, Arthur Pendelton, the accidental mayor, realized he was finally home. The London penthouse was sold. The trading floor was a distant memory. He was a man of the land, a guardian of a village, and a friend to a goat. It was the most expensive mistake he had ever made, and easily the best investment of his life. He took his phone out of his pocket, walked over to the bar, and handed it to Martha. "Martha, take this. Don't give it back to me until Saturday afternoon. No matter what I say. Even if I tell you I need to check the markets." Martha took the phone and dropped it into a heavy wooden box behind the bar labeled the Drunk Purchasing Prevention Zone. "Smartest thing you've said all day, Lord Arthur," she chuckled. Arthur picked up his pint, turned to his neighbors, and made a toast. "To Oak Haven," he said. "The town that bought me." The 12 apostles raised their glasses, the goat let out one final bleat of approval, and outside, the stars began to twinkle over the quietest, loudest, most expensive, and most valuable village in England.